Hi, this is Paul. It's going to be another short video because I just don't have time to make a long one. I want to do a little bit of follow-up on the video that I released on Monday, which I really weighed whether or not I should release it. Some people said, oh, you definitely have to release it. The obsolete religion that Trent Horn and Peter Boghossian share. Now, obviously, the word religion is sort of the tricky part there because Trent Horn is obviously a Roman Catholic and Peter Boghossian is obviously an atheist. And how would a Roman Catholic and an atheist share a religion? And they sort of share the religion of, what shall we call it? If we're following Ian McGilchrist, I guess it could be Emissarianism. How about that for a word? Emissarianism. And I got that partly because, of course, the conversation between Peter Boghossian and Jonathan Pageau begins with this question, what is religion? And Jonathan Pageau talks about religion being a binding thing. The difficulty that I see often when Pageau takes that route with people is that, especially sort of moderate or high status people that Jonathan is talking to, they haven't watched hours and hours of his programming to give you a sense of what exactly he's talking about, because it's not the easiest thing to sort of walk into right away. What I did on Twitter, sort of following up on it, is this little definition. Your religion is the meaningful, there's a typo in there. Great. Is the meaningful collective agency you participate with in pursuit of your sacred time. Now, I did that sort of following up on the other little video I did on John Vervaeke's, when he asked sort of his 3 questions of meaning, and one of his questions is, what would you want? Let me rephrase it a little bit. What situation would you like even if you didn't exist? What situation to be real? What situation to be there? And I talked about that sort of sacred time. Now, my schedule has sort of been swallowed by a death and a funeral and some of the pastoral care details that need to be handled for a particular family right now. But what I was saying in that video was that we all sort of have a desired future, a preferred future in mind. And in the secular frame, it's very much seen as a future within sort of the time space that we're used to, ordinary time. Charles Taylor, in his book, The Secular Age, notices that time isn't just always ordinary time. He notices that in almost every religious community, there's sort of special times that are different from ordinary times. And a skeptic, of course, might see that as a projection or unusual or BS or something like that. But it's a normal cognitive function that we have. Now, again, someone might push back and say, the only time that matters is, let's say, ordinary time that we all sort of share. But even that ordinary time breaks down because you'll notice that time does not move at the same speed, even though your clock moves at the same speed. I just got back from a vacation. And when you go on a trip, for example, like I was just on a trip to Europe, time very much slows down when you go to a new place. That's sort of perceptual time. There's kairos and chronos. And sort of time is a very strange thing. And existence is a very strange thing. And there are, even, I think, cognitively speaking, there are different times that people participate in. Now, again, someone is going to want to say, let's say in Emissarianism, that no, there's only ordinary time. But I think John Vervaeke nicely talks about how that's just sort of a flattening down of everything, and it doesn't really work. Now, of course, part of what Jonathan Pageau is pushing at, and this was what was so interesting about Trent Horn's video, is that a lot of what he was pushing against is sort of much more of a phenomenological approach to being and time. And it was so striking that someone who is as religious as Trent Horn, at least he's a Catholic apologist on YouTube, that he would be so adverse to something like sacred time or sacred space or holy things or something like that, because of course his religion is based on it. If you were to ask me for a definition of a Roman Catholic, I would probably say something of someone who participates in the Eucharist. And based on his video, one might say someone who knows and agrees with the truth. And it's like, that's a very Protestant way of going about it. And I noticed one person said something like, "You're a very strange Calvinist," because of course the Protestants in many ways sort of forefronted this. But my argument here is what religion really is people's pursuit of sacred time and sacred space. They want a preferred future, and they want that preferred future to be eternal. Now, what do I mean by that? Eternal isn't just more time. Eternal is really much more, let's say, sacred time. And you see this all the time politically. I made that point in the video where everybody's like, well, if we elect, I don't know, maybe for some people Donald Trump is like the greatest candidate they could ever imagine, and if Donald Trump takes office, then you'll never have to vote again, then all politics will be ended. I mean, that's very much a religious approach to things, because, well, it's like the end of history, and after the Cold War, history would sort of end. And, you know, the political left and the political right both have their own versions of this. And in fact, I would argue that these versions, this way of thinking, this way of talking is nearly inescapable unless you sort of kind of devolve into some kind of nihilism. And I think in many ways, this is sort of the heart of the meaning crisis. Now, part of this is made more difficult because, of course, in the modern period, there was a separation between religious life and non-religious life. And that was sort of a pragmatic solution to endless religious conflicts that could never sort of seem to be satisfactorily adjudicated. And so they said, let's take all of this stuff, the virgin birth, the Trinity, let's take all of this theology, let's push it to the side, and then let's just agree sort of about the relations of things within ordinary time. And I think, I could cue the Tim Keller video, that worked for a while. But what happened was that, and what's been happening is that we're increasingly recognizing that, in fact, many of our assumptions within ordinary time are built on religious foundations, even if we didn't call them religious, because they're not included in the groups of things we sort of push to the side. And now suddenly all kinds of people like Peter Boghossian are discovering that, hey, wait a minute, a lot of these things that are getting pushed to the side, let's say by wokeism, we need those things. We shouldn't push those things to the side. And right there, in a way, we begin to see what Tim Keller pointed at, that actually Western society was built on a foundation and some agreed upon assumptions, many of which were implicit. And as long as there was, let's say, a good enough herd immunity of those ideas in the culture would work. And as we've seen the recession of Christianity, we've seen less and less of those assumptions in the culture, and suddenly far more basic questions are rising to the surface, questions that people who assumed the end of history never thought we would actually engage again. And many of these are far older questions. And this has led to skepticism about liberalism and a whole bunch of things. So in all of this, the definition of religion that in many ways has sort of served implicitly Christian culture fairly well is slipping away. And that's a dangerous thing, because now suddenly whole other things are up for grabs. And that has led to, let's say, the assertion that we need a reintroduction of confessional Christianity back into the political sphere in order to restore the culture that we've lost. You can include me with many people who are skeptical that simply including these things into political coding will be sufficient, because it actually needs to be far deeper in people's worldview assumptions about what good, bad, right, and wrong are, that will sufficiently orient people to arrange their lives and arrange assumptions that they never questioned before to be in these directions. I think part of the service that Jordan Peterson has rendered is that I think he and Peugeot have nicely illustrated how you need a value hierarchy. And in fact, the value hierarchies that we have assumed in our time are based on religious assumptions and assumptions from the Bible. And so these sort of filter all the way up the stack. It doesn't mean that people do them perfectly. It often means that people can't even articulate them. They just simply assume them. I've got a couple other videos that I want to make that will deal with assumptions, and we'll call it Emissarianism, because Emissarianism you can sort of only do if you're sort of framed and containered in enough presuppositions and assumptions that you can say, okay, here's the smaller area of things like facts and agreement and logic we can work with to make the system work. But as soon as those assumptions and frames go away, well, suddenly you don't know what facts you have to look for. You don't know how to orient yourself in the world. And that's where we're at as a culture. But again, I'm skeptical that simply dealing with this on the political level, you can actually address the problem. And I think in many ways, again, when I look at the relationship between Pius XI and Pius XII and Mussolini, I think in many ways they were hoping to sort of get back to a Catholic monarchical worldview through Mussolini in order to shore up and recapture the days gone by. And I think the whole story basically illustrates you can't go that way. It's first religious, and then following on that, politics follows. Religion is always, politics is now. And religion is eternal, and politics is of the moment. And so you actually have to have broad herd immunity of ideas. You need that. You need at least sufficient mass, because we in fact do believe in groups. And when you have insufficient numbers of people who are sort of always subconsciously, unconsciously code checking and worldview checking with each other, if those numbers get too small, then suddenly the assumptions that have sort of held up the culture no longer work. And again, so people who want to say, well, let's fix this politically, I don't think it gets fixed politically. I think the political level is the wrong level to address it. I think it has to be at the personal, worldview, religious level of basic assumptions about what is good, what is in sacred time and sacred space that I am doing all of this engineering to achieve. And again, hopefully, when I have time to make a longer video, I can illustrate some of this with more illustrations. But I had like 20 minutes to make a video, and so I'll put this out tomorrow morning, and maybe that will clarify a little bit of what I mean.